life in 3 dimensions got me bent and got me twisted. I know I done said a lot, but I should probably stop pretending. I don't really hold the key and I can't really push a button. I just step up to the mic and try my very best to bust it, but I ran out of breath. It's tight in my chest, my feet just might fail. I can't stand the pressure.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Racially Speaking, where we have real and honest conversations about race as it's viewed through the lenses of faith, family, and vocation. I'm your host, David Phipps, and I think this is episode 50, so that's I guess that's kind of cool, like an obligatory, my guest is celebrating for me. Obligatory celebration of 50 episodes, so we didn't necessarily plan this be episode 50, but this is pretty cool. I have a really special guest joining me today. If you follow the podcast or my personal account on social media, you know who this is already, but I'm joined by Dr. Lauren Mims. Dr. Mims is currently an assistant professor at NYU. I'm just going to read all of this if that's okay, Dr. Mims, because it's extensive.
Okay,
I know you're not fishing for compliments, but it's really to help plug the episode by giving just all your credentials, because this is a huge honor by having you on here. All right, you are, assistant professor in the Department of Applied Psychology at NYU, NYU Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. Prior to joining NYU, you were an assistant professor of educational psychology at Ball State University. You earned your doctorate in educational psychology, applied developmental science at the University of Virginia School of Education. Shout out to UVA. There's a Virginia connection. Dr. Mims, you obtained a BA in English and psychology. So you have every psychology degree possible, I guess, from the University of Virginia in 2012, and an MA in child development with a concentration in clinical developmental health from Tufts University in 2014. Whew! Wow. That's incredible.
Thank you.
I don't know how it's possible to have that many degrees at our age, but wow.
A lot of school all the time.
Yeah. I mean, that had to be just straight through since college, correct?
Yes. I took a brief leave of absence to go work at the Obama White House, but undergrad,
that's
master's, PhD, and then spent some time in the Obama White House, and then jumped into the professor life. Wow.
That's fantastic. Did you know that was just going to be a brief stint before you went back to school? Or did you know you wanted to do the professor thing?
Yeah. So it was actually, I received the offer during my first year of my PhD. And so I started as an intern. And wow. It was really neat the Obama administration had created the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans. My work is focused on thinking about how we can ensure that Black children thrive from the moment they wake up. So what their home kind of experience is, once they get on the bus or whatever, kind of go out into the world in the neighborhood. What does that look like? How can that be supportive? Once they get to their kind of school settings, what do supportive schooling environments look like? What are the teachers saying? What are the peers like, right? What are they kind of enriching education to the moment that after school? So whether they go after school to a childcare setting, is that childcare setting being supportive and nurturing? To the moment they go to bed at night, and thinking about how can we ensure that they are being kind of supported and in healthy, growth cultivating environments. So the Obama administration created this initiative focused on educational excellence for African Americans. And what I loved is this idea of this unapologetic focus on Black child development. So for me, I feel like I was a person who, and I love the idea of thinking about kind of this idea that you plan and God laughs, right? Yeah. And that you can have this huge 5-year plan. I was a big planner. I probably around me has C3 planners right now. So I had a plan. Okay. I knew that I was going to move from getting my PhD. I was moving for my PhD and I was going to become a professor, and I was going to do all of this in 4 years. So in 5 years, I was going to be a faculty member. And so I saw a summer internship. I applied knowing that was a little bit different than my plans, because most people do research over the summer. But I said, let me go for it. It sounds like an incredible opportunity to intern at this initiative that's really focused on Black children. It's a great place to learn. And this seems like a once in a lifetime opportunity, right? To have an administration where you have your president and first lady are Black, who look like you, who are really focused on thinking about, how to support Sasha and Malia. And when thinking about that, how to support all African American children.
Mm-hmm.
So to make a very long story short, I ended up getting the offer. I went for 3 months as an intern, and I told myself, I am going to be the best intern there is. If they want me to staple things, I'm going to make sure that the staples are straight. Like, I am going to do all the things. I'm going to do them and be excellent, no matter what they are. And so on the last day of the internship, the executive director said to me, you don't have to say goodbye. He's like, wow, I was so offended. I'm like, wow, I thought like, oh, we've had such a, something happened. Like, what happened? What did I do wrong? Yeah. And he said, oh, well, you're not going anywhere. And I said, well, actually, I'm definitely going back to my PhD. Like, this is my plan. I'm going back to get my PhD, and then I'm going to be a professor, and I'm going to do all these things. And so he said, no, stay tuned. So I went back to work on my PhD. I was in coursework, and then I was helping a little bit on some of the events that they had going from the University of Virginia. I was just helping with some White House events that we had scheduled. And then I received a call that there was a senior appointment available in the Obama administration. So it would be a presidential appointee. So the way that presidential appointees, they work is that you serve at the pleasure of the president. And so actually you have to leave on inauguration day with the president. Okay. So there are career staffers, there are people who go throughout administrations. Because you can imagine it would be terrible if there was total turnover of all of the branches of government every time there was a new president. Sure. So there are people who in terms of like student financial aid, there are career people who are amazing, right? Who focus on student financial aid across any administration. And so they know the ins and outs. But then the political staffers will come in and talk about the specific things related to whatever financial aid initiative may be run by the president. And so for me, I was focusing on educational excellence for African Americans, really taking this kind of the paradigm that the Obama administration had and thinking about when we support and elevate Black children's education, and we advance the nation. So I moved back to Virginia and served until Inauguration Day. I drove my moving van back to the University of Virginia. And then a few days later, I was sitting back in the classroom.
Wow. So before we get into some of the specifics, so a presidential, did you say appointee, or what was that called? Okay, yep. Appointee, yeah. Mm-hmm. So, I'm assuming that's pretty closely related to, like, what was your day-to-day like?
I love that question. So it's one of the jobs where there is no day-to-day, which is really neat. I think that was what made the Obama administration really cool. And it makes sense I hadn't necessarily noticed from the outside, but a lot of a political appointment, right? Politics are ever changing. So for example, I know we're going to talk about kind of contemporary politics, but you can imagine for someone who, if I were in a director role at the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans when the affirmative action decision came out, then a lot of the things, my typical day there would be thinking about doing kind of writing messaging for constituents. So people who are following the listserv, what statements, how do we help people make meaning of what this what specific policies or legislation mean for Black individuals.
Oh my gosh.
I would
Perfect. Yeah. I'm just going to have you do that for us on a, just the equal scale.
Yeah, exactly. I would go to briefings or convene briefings. So one thing that was important to me, and particularly to the Obama administration, was elevating student voice. So we would have briefings around things like discipline policies and dress code policies, and thinking about discriminatory dress code policies where Black students are more likely to be disciplined for wearing outfits that are similar to their peers, but they're kind of surveilled more often. And so what we would do is we would say, here's the statistics, then, what's the percentage and the rate and the disparity. But then we would have young students who would come in and share their stories of what that looks like. And so I think we have to have both of those to think about how to move forward. So that was, those were events. Some days I would have summits. So we would host summits for educators on thinking about how to have caring, nurturing, culturally grounded classrooms that support Black children. Other days I would go to different convenings and events, or some days I just sat at my desk and did a lot of writing.
Gotcha. Yeah, man, that sounds like such an interesting, unique time, as you've already said, for sure. All right, you've already touched on it in more ways than one, but let's go into what's kind of the hot button thing from the past, has it been a week or so? So I want to get your thoughts, obviously, on affirmative action being struck down by the Supreme Court, I guess about a week ago now. And I want to get your brief thoughts first, only brief because I want to ask you more specific things as we go through it. Okay, so affirmative action was struck down by the Supreme Court, specifically from what I understand, the racial element. I guess higher education admissions cannot consider race as an main factor or a factor in the admissions process. That's I guess bare bones. So I guess I'm assuming listeners have read things from both sides of the argument for or against at this point by the time this comes out, and so I'm assuming we are all kind of versed to different levels in what to think about it. So I wanted to kind of talk about some knee-jerk reactions and obviously get from you, Dr. Mims, like some practical and just bring us back to reality. Okay, what's actually happening? Is it as bad? Is it not as bad? Is it, anywhere in between? So first, okay, affirmative action struck down. My first question, I guess, is, are people of color, mainly the Black community, actually being affected like overnight? Like are the effects being quickly felt as it seems like they are according to, headlines and maybe social media and stuff?
This is a great question. When the Supreme Court decision came in, I thought a lot about where this is going to be one of those moments where it's like, where were you when this thing happened? Do you ever have those weird meta moments where you think that this is a really important moment in history and I'm going to try and remember where I am when this happened? So I was actually with 25 young Black girls when the decision happened. It just happened. They didn't have their phones and I just happened to look at my phone. And so for me, I think it was hard for me to see they're going into high school. They're very worried about thinking about how to get into college and what that will look like. And I immediately thought about, for students who they're particularly in Richmond, Virginia, in thinking about access and opportunity, and also how race is so entangled in all of those things, what it means when that will no longer be able to be used as a consideration. So I think that it definitely is felt. I think it should be felt by all communities. The affirmative action decision, interestingly, wasn't actually written originally as a form of reparations in the way that many people think of, right? That there had been kind of decades of systemic inequities, and this is a chance to repair those inequities. Was actually around very similar to the Brown v. Board of Education decision as it relates to thinking about diversity. That when you have diversity in school settings, then we're all stronger. Okay. And so I think with that in mind, I think then that all communities should take a pause and think about what would it look like if the classrooms, whether you're in college now or whether you've graduated from college, if when you walked, did I freeze? When you walked into when you walk into a room, and for me as a professor, it is wonderful to see a diverse classroom of folks because I know they'll have diverse perspectives, backgrounds, knowledge, expertise, that I have a really rich classroom environment. And so I think all folks should be anxious about what that will look like at the end of affirmative action. It won't just be that there will be, less Black students who will get get into universities. It will be that the kind of universities themselves will fundamentally look different than they do right now.
Okay.
And I think for me, that's something that that immediately kind of hurts my heart, because I think that having kind of diverse and rich classroom environments is something that was important to me in college, important to me as a professor. I think important to my students. I love when someone says, I was thinking about this problem in this way, and brings in, right now I have, it brings in this new theorist. One student was talking about Asian American therapeutic practices and said, I was talking about there's a new theory of radical healing. And I was like, Black Americans have come up with this theory of radical healing. He said, oh, wow, that matches so much with a particular practice. And so we talked about the similarities, and that moment was so important to me, and thinking about that there can be these really rich dialogues, and what does that look like if we are not, if we take at face value affirmative action idea of thinking about diversity and kind of promoting and supporting diversity in our kind of higher ed environments.
Definitely. All right, yeah. So you touched on a lot. So some of the, knee-jerk reactions to something like this happening are, I've seen it's not that big a deal because most schools didn't have policies anyway. Perspectives like, well, have we already, someone asked me this, and I answered this person, but it was kind of just an educated guess and some of my thoughts, but I'd love to ask you. Some wonder, like, have we already accomplished, or are we like anywhere close to accomplishing what it was put in place for, which you touched on, that affirmative action was much more related to a diversity perspective versus reparations, which I guess they can kind of be intertwined sometimes, but, or there's the other one would be, as far as knee-jerk reactions go, is that it's good that it was struck down because it was it's discriminatory towards, white people. So, I know that was a lot. So one question that I think is fair to ask, and I think is an interesting thing to just, I guess, like a good thought exercise, is what was the state of most public universities, I guess, before it was struck down? Because this was largely applied to what happened with UNC Chapel Hill, Harvard, and more the Ivy League type schools versus, as far as the cases that were brought to the Supreme Court. So like I've heard that, I teach at Radford University, much smaller school that people don't know as well, obviously. And I was told that most schools at that level, I guess, don't typically have affirmative action. And I don't know about, specifically Radford, I'm not throwing them under the bus, but I don't know. Yeah, I just don't know. I was told that most of that level institution doesn't have actual policies put in place, if that makes sense. Doesn't mean they don't consider race, but with it being struck down, I get it when someone would ask, well, is that really going to affect things as much as people think? So I would wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, this is a good question. I think my colleagues in student affairs and higher ed could probably answer this a little bit better than I can. But I will say the idea here is not that I think people typically think about affirmative action like there's that schools that have affirmative action have a kind of a checklist, and they may say, okay, let's consider race, and then that puts somebody in a different pile. That's actually not the way that it works. Is thinking about when we talk about kind of, for those of you who kind of attended university, I remember when I was in high school, it was a lot about, they talked about the whole package, right? It's your whole package. So it includes your SATs, your ACTs, it includes the courses you're enrolled in, the extracurriculars, your personal statement, right? Like all of these become your whole package.
Yeah.
So when we think about affirmative action, kind of like my identity as a Black woman is part of my whole package, right? And so it's not affirmative action is not that there's something like there are not quotas, right? That we have to have a certain number of African-American people so they're in a different pile. The idea here is that part of the whole package, the things that could be considered, is race is a factor, that is part of your whole package, in the same way that schools often send sheets about your college, or I mean, sheets about your high school that say things like what types of extracurriculars were offered. Do you have ranking systems? So are some schools rank, right? They have valedictorians, or they may have access to APs and honors courses. But one thing we can't do, the idea of having that base sheet and that additional information, is if we didn't have that information, then somebody could come and we see people who are just all in honors classes, right? And they haven't taken any AP classes. What if there were no AP classes to be taken at the high school? So that's an important context to consider, right? That we can't actually penalize a student for not having access to things in which they cannot, they could, if they wanted to, they wouldn't have access to. Right. So all of those become this kind of admissions package. And so part of the admissions package is also like race could be considered part of the admissions package, but it was never used in a way that was kind of a checkmark advantage. Like, is this check minority, that puts them at a different place. It really has always been used in thinking about the holistic package. And so when people think about, well, what will it look like post affirmative action, we're kind of thinking about, right, what it looks like into a future. So there's no way that anyone can necessarily speculate, but there have been places which other people have mentioned. Michigan does not have affirmative action. It's been a while, and as well as the California schools do not have affirmative action. And what we did see is that when affirmative action was banned, there was a decline in the number of Black students who were in schools, and some of them have actually never recovered and bounced back. So the University of Michigan does not have very many, the flagship school of Michigan does not have many Black students. And so thinking about what barriers exist in our systems that are prohibiting the full kind of access and opportunity for Black students, particularly thinking about Black students in Michigan, to attend the flagship university when we remove a part of someone's whole package.
So what does it look like practically I read about California a lot. I didn't read about Michigan necessarily, but the same results, like with this like race neutral approach, which is, I guess, kind of been recommended in replacement of affirmative action by people, opposing affirmative action. Thinking through that, why is all the evidence I've seen is that exactly what you said, it has been proven over and over again to not work and have the results that you would imagine, less people of color getting admitted. So I don't know. I think there's those obvious statistics that show that that's not working. That's not a great way to go. Could you even be a little more specific, like break down like what it is? Because I get it. I think it's helpful to look from other people's point of view too. So like, why does that not work? Like, if that makes sense, if you're taking when you touched on the other factors that it's kind of ignoring, as you're talking about your race, ethnicity as part of your identity, removing that, how is that then equating to less diversity, I guess?
Yeah. So I think in a level, it reminds me a bit of the idea towards color blindness, right? And thinking about telling children like, we don't see color. But what you're actually really moving towards is that you don't hold bias and prejudice opinions towards people because of their race, right? Like that's the goal. The goal is actually not to see, because there's not anything that is wrong with brown skin. So if we say that we're not seeing someone's brown skin, what we're actually really thinking is what we're trying to teach children is not to see brown skin in a way that is biased or discriminatory. And so, but the colorblind that argument doesn't actually work. What works instead is that, right? Is actually talking about the way that, and similarly, we have this kind of like color silence that Beverly Tateman talks about. Like when you're in the grocery store and people say like, oh my gosh, that person has brown skin, mom. And the first thing people say is like, they say like, shh,
Yeah.
That silence, right, is contributing, as somebody who's a developmental psychologist, contributes to the differences, right? And those differences then with that silence are that there's something deficient or less than about that person because like, I can't talk about that thing, right? There's something. And so we're really starting these. So in the same way of this idea of saying like, there is no color blindness person, like it's not a thing in the way that like
right.
I think that's the exactly right. So when I think of my full self, I also think about my own, like even if I didn't, I mean, I'm a Black woman, so I would check kind of like that I identify as Black and as a woman on a, typical admissions essay. But even thinking about the extracurriculars I was involved in, or even thinking about my personal statement, all of those things for me are also related to me being a Black woman. And I grew up in an environment where that was resource rich. So it also doesn't mean that, so I didn't have it didn't affect the access that I had because of thinking about things like historically entrenched redlining that exists, may influence my neighborhood, may influence, right? So I think that color, having this kind of race neutral approach is that we don't live race neutral lives. Yeah. So we can't have if we had this kind of like universal opportunity and equity in schooling environments, and then I think that we could possibly say like we should take a race neutral approach. I think for me and for many Black Americans, like there's a lot of pride in being Black. And so I never want to say like, is there a time where we can not talk about race anymore? Because that is a place of kind of pride for me. But I think kind of circling it back to your conversation, I think Ketanji did a great job in kind of really thinking about when she was talking about what is fundamentally wrong with this is, I think it's just really important to think about that there is no way to, based on how society is set up, there's no way that race has not influenced the access, the opportunities, and the positions that we are in society.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's good. That's really, really helpful. Okay, I think you brought up the specific scenario that I think a lot of people are calling into question or referring to in this whole discussion, and it's the checking the box thing. So what I would think people that are pushing back on affirmative action, not that are in support of the overturning of affirmative action, I think would say the checking the box part, they're worried that it's what affirmative action is doing is being discriminatory in and of itself towards white people. So, reverse discrimination isn't the answer to correcting discrimination is kind of the pushback. So I would think specifically they would view, say yourself, all your credentials and, internships, everything you've worked on and been a part of for various reasons, then side by side to a white applicant, I think they're viewing you being able to check, I'm Black, as the reason you would get into somewhere, an institution ahead of them. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Perspective, just as kind of a thinking through it.
Yeah. So I was just thinking about, if folks have not read it, Fordham University actually has one of the strongest and most helpful statements on the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. But one thing that they and I'm actually going to read it because it's like that good. Great. But basically what they say, the debates over the use of race in admissions miss some fundamental facts. This is not about people skipping the line. When universities recruit a class, it's not possible for us to line students up in rank in order of merit, as any of you who've ever made a subjective hiring decision understand. We know that a student who spends a years in private tutoring to ace a standardized test is not necessarily smarter than the rest, which is why most of us have gone test optional. We know that incoming GPAs from a variety of schools are not created alike. We also understand that talent comes in many forms, including the brilliant creativity of an artist, the fierce discipline of an athlete or dancer or soldier, and the remarkable acts of leadership. Most of all, we know students who have overcome tremendous obstacles in their life, from the death of a parent to growing up in rural poverty, come with critical resilience and grit. And so the idea here is what they're saying is now the court has given us very mixed messages on whether we consider one in only one of those obstacles, that of overcoming racism. And so what they cite is studies that say that identical resumes, when they change the name to have a name that sounds Black and a name that sounds white, the white sounding name is more likely to get the job than the Black sounding name, just based on the exact same resume, but changing the name of the person. That like doctors they talk about doctors on average give less pain medication to African-American patients when they undergo the same procedure. And so they'll have the same leg surgery that's happening, but like my leg pain and a white person's leg pain, you could argue could be similar, right? There's nothing about melanin that impacts my ability to feel pain. However, on average, Black kind of Americans are given less pain medication. So this idea then thinking about is this there is no, if we know that those are the things that happen and then we're told to kind of ignore them, then the idea is really thinking about that some of the talent will be missed because we are because of the inability to have that specificity in that way. Like the research, like important research was done when we found the difference in pain medication. This was actually a study that was done at the University of Virginia. Everybody underwent training to ensure that they weren't, when they saw the patient in the bed, that they were actually not seeing that patient or that application in ways that was prohibiting them from actually accessing places of healing. So I think similarly, we have to think about what happens where the individual, when we remove this idea of thinking about social categories in the United States, then impact then the kind of the treatment of the materials in which African American students send in. And that's something that's supposed to be ignored. But it doesn't ignore the reality that until it was brought up and until it was seen that there were differences, particularly in the hospital situation, and how pain was being treated. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Oh, that's a fantastic example.
So what I worry about is, in the same way, flipping it around, one thing I look at is I just did a big systematic review of Black children in brilliance. And what I looked at is thinking about that when we have this brilliance and creativity, we have this definition of creativity. And this definition of creativity is very old and was not created where we had this like kind of foundational scholars talked about creativity looks like this. And what I did is look at creativity among Black scholars. And what I found is creativity among Black students looks different. But what I worried about was, when it was interesting, there was only 3 studies on Black children and creativity in creativity journals. I had to go elsewhere to try and find what it looked like, what creativity looked like for Black children. So what I worry about is thinking about if we haven't reached a point in society where there isn't these racialized understandings of brilliance or creativity, right? And so for folks who are at admissions tables, thinking about if somebody says that they have been working on creating murals all around Richmond as a way to revitalize their community, is that seen in the same way as somebody who is a chess champion who has been training with a private tutor in chess for the past decade? To me, I'm like, that's brilliant. Both children are brilliant, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think that there is, and I think for people who are listening, they may say, well, I mean, both of those students could get in. And I agree. And that's the goal. That would be the goal.
Absolutely.
But what they're saying is kind of taking the holistic package into account may also provide more context for why people are doing what they're doing. And so this idea is just thinking about that when we think about society and the diversity of society, and that diversity, I believe, is a huge strength of, being in the United States, that considering that having race be a component of people's admissions, that is a way in which we create universities and which we are proud of. And I think that the other underlying thing I would kind of just touch briefly is that this is race-based affirmative action. There are also other statuses you can hold that then give you different priority, right? And that you are kind of seen. And so I think but they're also not likened in the same way.
Well,
so for example,
which there wasn't the same amount of pushback on, right?
Exactly. So I think actually there were some advocates recently who actually, I think they sued Harvard, I believe, over legacy admissions. Yeah. Right. And legacy admissions are different. Legacy admissions are, if you say you are a legacy, then that is a check, right? There is a check in because you are a legacy, right? Then there may be certain procedures that are done because of your status. That is not the same for race. There's no African Americans all go to one pile and other people go to the other pile, or we look at a white American and a black American together and we say, oh, because this person's black, we're Brit. That's not the way that affirmative action works. Legacy admission does say that there are certain there may be certain slots that are available or consideration that is made for folks who have a certain legacy status. In the same way that athletics, right? Folks who are coming in on athletic scholarships, they're coming in to come onto a football team, right? Then that is also something that is taken into consideration. And so I think it's very important to kind of dismantle some of it is, I think it's a weird thing, right? It's hard. Few people are actually admissions committee members at universities, right? Right. So how do we know? How would the person know what's happening behind the scenes, right? But I think some of the assumptions are made that shortcuts are being taken where people are put in different piles and that they're given an advantage that then means inherently someone else who doesn't have that status has a disadvantage. And I think that is not the case for race, but people are arguing that is the case for things like legacy, legacy admissions or those who are donors for particular things. Then that might be earmarked as people who have to take a different consideration than other folks.
Yeah, I mean, some of the staggering stats that I read were helpful to shed light on the error in believing that the opposite wasn't true. So, I mean, what I mean is, I follow sports pretty regularly, and one of the stats was, I think it was 70% of athletic scholarships are, white students. But, I think, and this informs a lot of different ways that race pervades everything. But, it's tempting as just a casual consumer of sports on television, college sports, to just think, oh, well, all these black athletes are taking all these scholarships, or are the ones that are getting all this special treatment just for athletics, which may be true in certain sports like a basketball and football. But 70% of college scholarships, I guarantee you, no one knows that. In the grand scheme of things, forget about, I don't know, I assume, soccer, even, rowing or crew. I'm trying to think of volleyball, I don't know, all these smaller sports, lacrosse, tennis, all these, sports that people forget because they're not on TV, that, we give scholarships for these sports as well. And then, the thing that's just, I think, inarguable is no one really has come to, at least not as far as it getting taken to the Supreme Court, but the legacy stats are just, even before you brought them up, I was just I don't know how you argue with that, because it's not as if this has been brought up and we're arguing about it. It's that the race thing was just brought up and boom, it's done. But these legacy stats are so not even like comparable. Like institution after institution, I was reading them. Just I guess Harvard was like 40% of I can't remember. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I couldn't remember if it was 40% of the. I don't know if it was the white students. It was high of just how many legacy students there are, and I just kept reading stat after stat after stat. And I was like, that's crazy. And for me, I mean, in these conversations, as I know you know, like so often we find ourselves coming back to, can we? I mean, look, I didn't bring this up, but can we just if we're going to do this, let's be consistent. And that's where I think injustice lies so often, just the egregious inconsistency and lopsided disenfranchisement of people of color, especially the black community, which I did want to segue into that a little bit, because I was listening or reading something, I can't remember, and this person was kind of as a journalist, I think it was Michael Harriot, breaking down kind of the difference between white supremacy and anti-blackness. And I think that's relevant, which I'd love to ask you about, because this specific case with the Supreme Court and everything in affirmative action was really kind of pushed forward because of the narrative between, I'd say, Asian Americans being pitted against Black Americans in this whole thing. And has also garnered a lot of support from a specific group of Chinese Americans. Anyway, that was just giving specifics, but I would wonder what your thoughts are, not just as it relates to affirmative action, but just in general with that consistent narrative of that happening, with minorities being pitted against each other, but specifically the anti-blackness element. I know there's a long-winded question.
Still a big question. I appreciate it. I think that it's dangerous to, in terms of thinking about the way that the United States and this kind of like the way that race is kind of socially constructed, and people are like, race isn't real. But the idea here is thinking about like social constructions and the implications, those are real, right? Yeah. Like that, thinking about like the categorizations come with certain repercussions for individuals. And I also think that we often play this kind of oppression Olympics. And I think that's where Black Americans and Asian Americans get into this, like, oh, but y'all have this or this and this. And like, at the same way, like, we're all running the same race. And so like, I don't know, like if we all could think about taking different, picking up the baton at different times, I think we would go a lot further faster, rather than it becomes these conversations of thinking about like what does the race look like for each group. And I think then it becomes like, oh, this barrier. And so I think that I am super appreciative, and the folks who have really been talking about the model minority myth, right? And this idea of thinking about, and also the cost of the model minority myth on the mental health and wellness of Asian and Asian American folks. Like I think that is very important for us to discuss. While also, I think we also have to think about like, and that's important. And I think one of the things I do with my students is really talk about, like, have real discussions about higher ed. Like college can be really hard. Like failing and getting an F on your first exam is difficult. And some people will say, as an Asian American man, like it crushed me because like the expectations that were placed on me, right? And that's both kind of racialized and gendered. Yeah. Same thing happens when let's say, a Black woman fails an exam. The different types of kind of stress, the stress feels the same in my body and your body, it's still stressful, right? It's still an F. However, thinking about what kind of the way in which we respond to it, the way that society responds to it, like all of those things also matter. And so thinking about, for example, when a Black woman fails an exam, then often it can kind of lead to this idea of perpetuating some of the deficit narratives that exist, right? That Black women are lazy and that they're, more likely to drop out, or these things. When an Asian American male fails an exam, those same things are not typically the quick kind of racialized assumptions we make about why that student failed that exam. Yeah. It doesn't mean there aren't other ones, right?
Right.
So for example, like many of my students talk about, people will tell about, like, oh, the teacher said to me, oh, you write so well. And the student's like, I was born and raised in the United States. And so those also come from thinking about, right, biases and prejudice people hold because of race. And so I think that when we talk about the nuanced experiences, unique experiences we all have, then I think that that's important. But it often gets into a place of thinking about that, like the way that people perceive your oppression. Similarly, when thinking about affirmative action, it's like, because of this history of enslavement, you're getting preferential treatment, but also like, I deserve to be in these settings. And it's just, that's not the way that, and I think that goes back to this kind of perception that somehow admissions committees are putting every single application in a pile, and then they're moving based on race, certain people based on race. And so I think some of it is that, that is because of anti-Blackness, that is because of white supremacy, to say that that Black individuals are getting preferential treatment, and because of that treatment, it is prohibiting you from getting a slot to whatever university.
Yeah.
There's no way that person doesn't know that. Right. The person, the people who are filing the complaints, they didn't realize there was not some type of draft that or like a like a knockout that existed. And then we saw the knockout. And at the end, it was like it starts out on this bracket, and we've created this bracket. And then it's like, oh, this student versus this student. And this student wins because of this thing. And because of their race. Like, that's not the way it's working. And so I think that is manifestations of thinking about anti-Blackness and white supremacy that exist, that pit people against each other in that way. And it's just that's not the case. Like, while I am not in anybody's kind of who was filing the complaints. I'm not an admissions counselor. I've never been an admissions counselor, but I am thinking about similarly when I'm doing hiring for things like my lab, I'm not sitting there and putting people into certain, and highlighting certain things and putting them into different categories and different types of packages, right? But often what I see is when I have a very diverse lab. I have students of all races in my lab. And I ask them for just kind of a short cover letter. And one thing that's really is fit. Fit is really important, particularly for me. So when they talk about kind of the way that they are excited about the work and the contributions of the work and some of the backgrounds, experience that they had, I think for me, I also take into consideration that my lab will not look in the way that I want it to look if I only pick people who have had 7 other lab experiences before. Right?
Yeah.
And so for me, I have to think about the whole package. Folks who are super passionate about working with me, but have no experience doing data programming, then that to me is something that's really important. I know I can train them how to use data.
Yeah.
So somebody who has 10 years of Stata experience, but writes a cover letter that basically says, I put my name, cut out the last lab's name and put my lab in and said that that's why they want to work in my lab. They may not receive go to the next round of my consideration. Right. And so some of that is, but somebody could say my credentials, I have 10 years of Stata experience. You were looking for someone who was proficient in Stata. This other student, this is a Black student, talked about how passionate, and also thinking about they have great experience in they have, volunteered at the local YMCA for 7 years, and they have learned and seen people journey. But they don't have that 10 years of STATA experience. Then somebody could use the same argument to say, right, that I considered race race as a factor. But for me, as someone who knows that the way that my lab works is everyone will be trained in STATA. Yeah. Is it great if you have high proficiency in STATA, this kind of statistical programming? That would be wonderful. But if you just applied because you wanted to add something else to your repertoire of experiences,
sure,
and I choose that person over someone who has such rich kind of lived experience as well as theoretical understanding, does a lot of reading, then, the goal would be bring both. Often I bring both students in, right? Like, again, doesn't have to be, it's not always a competition between two students. However, though, I think it is completely fine if for the particular project I have, that it doesn't necessarily mean that the person who has the 7.0 GPA should be given priority over the person who has a 3.0 GPA when I'm looking at the entirety of the package.
Right. I mean, weren't we all told to be well-rounded in high school? I mean, at least that's what I remember hearing. What I'm saying. So,
whole package. So they take everything into consideration, right? Like you turn your transcripts in, your statements in, you have your recommendation letters, your extracurriculars, all of those. And so when admissions decisions, that's the way. But I think that that in these conversations, those types of nuance it goes away. Right. It turns out to be these three metrics, right? My SIC score was this, my GPA was this, and I went to this institution.
Right.
And particularly for admissions in kind of in a school like Harvard, I can anticipate a number of people have those exact same scores, right? Yeah. And so thinking about that whole package is really important.
Right. All right. So you've broken down, masterfully how affirmative action does and does not work. So as we begin to wrap up, is there like not a bright side, but is there maybe an optimistic view of, okay, this ruling actually, because people fundamentally have misunderstood what affirmative action, how it actually is playing out in admissions, is there an optimistic view of like, well, it's actually not going to change that much of things because the ruling is based on a couple of these complaints and cases that actually just have gotten it wrong? Or like, is the main concern that, to me, my connection is that it's a path, has already come from a path, but is furthering down a path of it being very concerning. But is there an optimistic view potentially that this alone isn't going to change as much as the Supreme Court might think because it doesn't work that way, as you've said? And the part that I'm connecting is, which I think is pretty strange and pretty disingenuous, is that I've also read that, okay, we're getting rid of affirmative action, but students are still going to be encouraged to talk about their experience, even if it has to do with race, with their entrance essays. But to me, I'm like, well, but I thought we're on the path to not being allowed to talk about race in schools, in high school, middle school, and whatnot. So, one, I'm like, well, how is that possible if they can write about it and then not be considered? But then also, I thought we're also moving towards not allowing them to talk about it. I don't know. So I guess my main question first.
I think though you're articulating, that's exactly what you are articulating, is that there's like a series of paradoxes, right?
Yeah.
I think that 2020, people said there was kind of a racial reckoning that existed, right? And really thinking about, I did a little bit of research, and there were places like Good Housekeeping and Parents Magazine that were talking about how to talk to your children about race in 2020. And I think now we right? And so, here's the way that you begin these discussions. Yeah. These are mainstream magazines having these conversations, particularly geared towards diverse audiences. That Black parents there's this thing called the talk, right? The talk has been, here's how you have a talk. That has been something that has been discussed for a long time. But there's kind of this mainstream conversation about how to talk to your children about race in 2020. And then now we're sitting a couple years later, right? And it's thinking about like, you can't consider race, and that we should have these kind of racial neutral perspectives. And I think that it does lead some people to kind of spin their heads a little bit and think about where does race fit in our lexicon, and also what level of importance does race play in the lived in people's lives. And so I think there is kind of a series of contradictions that are occurring here. I think in terms of thinking about optimism, I think one of the huge lines of the Obama administration was hope, right? And so he talks about, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think the continuation was that it doesn't just bend towards justice without us doing the bending, right? And so I think it's things like this, like having conversations with people, doing some great work to kind of clarify and better your understanding. And I think have conversations with the intent to understand rather than to argue or contradict is something that's really important. And I think that aligns for folks. And I think in thinking about a podcast that is aligned so much with faith, like that's what we should be doing, right? Like that aligns with a lot of the principles and kind of my religious beliefs, is thinking about this idea of like equity should be at the center of all that we do. And so I think a silver lining is that many universities have known that this Supreme Court was brought. So one clarification, it's the law of the land, right? Like Supreme Court. So it will affect the land. So that's important to consider rather than just a few people, even if it was brought by a few, right? It has implications for the nation. However, I think universities have that this was brought up, and we've known that this decision was going to come down for a while, and people have been following the case. Also, universities have been thinking about how to ensure for those who think that diversity is a key priority. They have been thinking and working to try and determine what that looks like to preserve that. And there are not ways, I don't want to position it as ways to get around the Supreme Court, because that then puts those who are doing the work towards justice in a kind of like protest stance. I think there are things that can be done that can be amplified. So, for example, I think something that's really important is thinking about universities. Some things that have helped is universities have done actually like really go to places and spaces where Black students are, and tell them about the university, and to increase folks and talk about the holistic admissions process. And that, because I think at the other end, I think that we haven't really talked about it, but like, it is not that. I think it's also dangerous to say without affirmative action that like Black students won't be able to get in, because then that basically says that affirmative action is giving people an undeserving advantage,
which we didn't touch on very much, but exactly.
Right. Because like without affirmative, similarly, I think you can mention my credentials. There's no way that I could say that I haven't benefited from affirmative action because affirmative action was in place in which I've applied to places, right? Or like there is a woman who talked about recently on a podcast with Katie Couric. She said that she asked her boss one time, like, did you hire me because I was Black? And he said yes. And she started, welling up and thinking about, oh my gosh, not because I'm worthy. And he was like, that's not it at all, actually. It's because in finance, there's no one who's in the financial department who's Black. You also have a strong understanding of thinking about redlining that exists and how that thinks about like Black people spending and all of these different things, right? But you did it. So I think it's also important to say that there are, based on the ways that metrics, people fall through the cracks. And so part of what that was thinking about, let's seal the cracks a little bit by having some policies that acknowledge that the cracks exist. So that doesn't necessarily say that that the students were not worthy. They were not already standing on the ground themselves, right? Like the idea of like Tupac, roses grow from the concrete. Like roses grow from the concrete. Like I've grown from the concrete. Like I will still keep growing whether there's affirmative action or not. But the principle of affirmative action talks about this idea of thinking about that we are ignoring deeply entrenched injustices and history, right? And that is something that in the year of 2023 is something that is disappointing to me. But I also think that there are things that really, really bright folks have been thinking about. How do we increase access to information about specific universities, as well as think about how do we, if things that like, you know, my kind of colleague started Pathways to College, and Pathways to College, they go into places like Newark. And so they go into Newark, and when they go into Newark, they talk with specific students about applying to college. They help them with preparing their application and their materials. They ensure that they have tutoring and that they have warm and caring teachers and support, and they feel belonging in their school. Those things matter. Those things help. And so I think there are folks, I taught a class in 2020 virtually with Black girls, and they wrote this poem called Power to the People during the pandemic. And basically what they said is that they were talking about how people are getting sick and how people are creating these murals. And so in DC, when the mural was created, the Black Lives Matter mural was created, and then people erased it. And they were saying these murals are being created and replaced and created and replaced. And but throughout all of this, people are rising, people are standing, people are collaborating, they're kind of engaging in direct action. And so all of those things matter as much as they did when this policy was like, when affirmative action was here and when it's not. I think we have to always think about I always look around me and think about, what does this room look like? And does this room reflect my values, the principles, and the diversity of this kind of very rich nation? And if not, what are barriers that are inhibiting people from entering this room? Once they're in the room, how do we ensure that this is a supportive room? And so I think when we all take that framework and we don't just kind of become complacent and say, oh, well, I guess we'll just have to see how this affirmative action policy, maybe it won't affect our school. That's dangerous, because what we saw in some places is that there were sharp declines particularly for Black student enrollment. So what if we know and we can anticipate that Black student enrollment may decline, then what are things that we can do right now before the next admission season to ensure that we can kind of preserve and provide access and opportunity to all folks, but particularly for Black individuals? So that's what I'm optimistic about. I'm ready. I am very much around thinking about like, how do we get on the ground and do the work? And I refuse to kind of see how things pan out. I think we all have to, again, arc of the moral universe, we have to bend. So whatever that bending looks like, I encourage folks in your kind of immediate environment to really kind of think about what that looks like. And little actions can kind of make up, of all of us do collective little actions, then I think we can push to ensure that that our universities look like places where that are diverse, and where people will be exposed to a diversity of opinions and ideas, and that we'll have chess players and muralists together, right? Like, I don't know, there could be a mural chess competition. Like the way that things happen with my students in that way is it's amazing, right? If I have somebody at NYU who is a muralist and a chess player, then they can talk about how they think about mapping murals mentally is very similar to thinking about mapping steps in chess, right? And I want rooms where those conversations happen rather than having rooms of all chess players, because chess players is something that has been codified as valued by society, whereas murals are seen as kind of vandalism or something that is not as a kind of a form of creativity. So I think we all have to kind of think about that.
That sounds like maybe you already wrote it, but a paper. Or presentation. Fantastic. Also, great Tupac reference. Speaking of interdisciplinary with
I am all about the musical references. I am surprised I haven't dropped any more. I think we've been talking very seriously about Supreme Court cases.
I'll have to have you back to have more just discussion, like hip hop or Tupac episode or something.
That would be great. I have like and also I feel like I would love to have more conversation. For those of you who are listening, like, you're incredible. The work that you've done is incredible, both kind of on the podcast as well as like with students. And so I know today there was a lot of asking me a lot of questions, but I think we can all learn a lot from you. So thanks.
I appreciate it. It means so much coming from you. Look, you went into my last question, so we've done it. It was going to ask what, we could be doing. And I think my takeaways from what you said is be involved holistically, which I think the irony to me is so funny that it seems like that's what affirmative action already is meant for. So the removing it is making us take steps backwards, but not in the way that people think. It's just making it harder to do what it feels like people opposing affirmative action want us to do and take a more holistic approach. But to me, it just, I don't want to end on a frustrating note, but it just seems like it's just such a fundamental misunderstanding of what's happening with affirmative action that is making us take a step back when really we're probably more united on this than people think, which is the danger which you touched on of a couple people complaining, but then for it to come to fruition and affect the whole land is that's also deeply concerning as well.
And I think as Audre Lorde says, we don't live single issue lives, right? And so this idea of thinking about that we have kind of made this a single issue when it is so much bigger than that, right? And I think the thing is reflecting on what we want society to look like. I think for me, I think about what world I want my students to be in. Some people may think, what world do I want my children to be in? What types of schooling environments? Going back again, from the moment a child wakes up to the moment they go to bed, like, what do I want their environment to look like? What do I want them? Who do I want them to interact with? What do I want them to learn about? And when we think about those things and we reflect on those things, then and also the very present threats that threaten that ability for that to happen, then I think we start thinking about, like you said, we're more alike than different. Or we're not, but also we should find other people who have like-minded interests. Right?
Exactly.
I won't say that all of society, has a similar vision on how I would like to walk through the world. But I know that in whatever place I'm in, I really look for, as Mr. Rajan says, like, look for the helpers. I look for the helpers. I look for the people. And I think we have to do both of those or we can get really tired, particularly in thinking about there are a lot of attacks and a lot of changes that have happened recently. And I think sometimes it can feel like, these things are happening to us and they're not always happening for us. But that doesn't mean that we can't kind of continue to rise and continue to collaborate.
Man, this is fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Mims, for learning
this. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. This was, indispensable knowledge. It's very helpful to know how to delve into this and unpack it personally, but then I know people, our listeners, going to benefit a lot from how you broke these things down for us. So thank you so much. Listeners, thank you so much for listening. Yeah, as always, music you're listening to is done by our guy Dylan Dent. Our artwork was created by Ashley Bush, and we'll see you guys next time.
The nightmare might scare you, no worse than reality. They hunt you by day, R.I.P. Ahmaud Arbery. Everybody got a time, but that's less than comforting. I hope I'm alive by the time they choose to comfort me. Mosquitoes in the vein, or leeches on my soul. This money on my mind is a fracture in my bones. You get crippled by continuing existence like a ghost. And they wonder why we drink, and they wonder why we smoke, and they wonder why we think that everything's a joke. I'm shocked that we can sleep, must be the thought of letting go.